Microsoft Windows 365 link, and our special guest, Martin Wimpress, also known as Wimpy. Cue the music. Hello, everyone. It's me, Bigpod. Josh is not here this week. He's on a very secret, top secret mission. He'll be back next week, I hope. But I have a special guest. It's Wimpy, better known, depending on who you are, as Martin Wimpress, the creator of Ubuntu Mate.
Hello, Bigpod. How you doing?
Hello, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm very well. This is kind of familiar for us. I mean, for people that don't know, we used to work together and we used to sit on video calls most days for a long time.
Yeah. And today we're going to talk about Windows 365 link and about Martin. Shall we get into it?
Go for it.
So, for those of you who don't know, who haven't heard the big news, Microsoft announced a new product called Microsoft Windows 365 Link, which is essentially a kinda a PC, but it's more really a thin client to connect you or your computer to the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Basically to display a cloud version of Windows instead of local one. And most media, or especially YouTubers, are making fun of it. But I don't think it's actually that funny of a topic or an idea. We're going back in time, if you ask me.
Yeah, but also this isn't a product for you or I or any of those YouTube commentators, right?
Yes.
When I worked at Canonical, there are hundreds of thousands of Linux users that don't know they're Linux users, right? There's these organizations that have got Linux desktops. So, banks and legal organizations, all sorts of organizations. This is the bread and butter for why companies like HP and Lenovo and Dell actually invest in Linux on the desktop, because they sell these business to business units that just go into these massive enterprises for huge deployments, 10,000 at a time. And this 365 link is predominantly for that market.
Yeah. Well, those of you who are in the industry for far longer than me may remember back in the day when you didn't have a computer at your desk. When you had this, sometimes even just a link, and sometimes a tiny device that did all the processing. But it all led back to a giant room with a very giant computer called mainframe.
Right.
That's basically that, but instead of it going to a room what could be next door or in a next building, it's going to your nearest Azure data center. Yeah. And yes, it's targeted primarily at businesses, primarily at companies that want to control how their internal landscape looks like. That's who the main target consumer is, not the normal individual consumer, not you and me. Although I am probably more of a target audience than you realize. I basically live that stuff already.
Right.
Not to the extent I want to, but I have my own tiny data center that has systems running that I just remote into, which is what this is. But why does it need to be a computer and not just a device that like it used to be back in the day? Because
this is classic Microsoft, right? You said client server, back in the day, in peak Windows, they were the client server company. This was the way it worked, except back then it was Windows NT servers in whatever your organization's, in air quotes, data center, not data centers like we know them today. Yeah. They were literally like a countable number of servers that were in a room somewhere, usually not more than a closet. So all that's changed here is that the client is thinner and dumber than it used to be. And the data center is, now in air quotes, the cloud, specifically, Azure. But this is not so different from like what I remember when I was at Sun Microsystems in the late 1990s. Back then, Sun Play was these thin Java clients talking to Java enterprise servers. It's nothing new. It's just cyclical, and we're just back in that cycle again.
Well, the reason these clients need to be that much stronger than they used to be is very simple: security.
Mm-hmm.
We need to secure these connections. So that's why they need to be that much more complex. They need to be computers. It's not anymore the time of when your computer didn't have password, your user account didn't have password because nobody was gonna hack you in. It's not 80s, 90s anymore. There is a reason all we Linux users don't want X11 anymore. Those of us who are sane. Because there is no security there. Because I can be, or in the terms of that time, I can be behind my desk and I can put a window on my colleague's desktop who is 3 desks behind me.
Yeah.
I know people did that because it was all X11 sessions on the same machine, after all.
And you talk about security there, which is interesting because I saw some of the commentators poking fun at the fact that there was a Kensington lock space on this $350 barely a computer. But that is a tick box because in order to go into enterprises, it needs that Kensington lock position because it needs to be bolted to a desk for those organizations to tick off on all of their asset register security and compliance pieces. So even that seems ridiculous at a surface level is there to service the market that this device is designed to serve.
Yeah. And another use I think of this device is more of like digital signage. Because
it could be.
At the end of the day, what you're doing is managing a fleet of devices.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be much easier to manage a fleet of devices that are dumb and all their images happen on cloud where you have much better access and you can the OS is OS, no matter where it is. But you have better manageability than 1,000 devices or 100 devices spread around your factory to show, I don't know, a statistic or a stock price or something.
Yeah. Yeah, we've all seen those photographs that people have taken in airports and streets where those digital signage devices have either got the blue screen of death or, goodness gracious, a busted Linux boot screen that's failed partway through. Yep. We've seen them before, and over the years we've seen some of those devices transition to things powered by Apple stuff, which is managed by MDM, or Android-like devices, which again have fleet management capabilities.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if Microsoft can actually win back some of that, favor with a device like this. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people have been burned by their experiences with Windows in those 24/7 type deployments, particularly through updates. Maybe this device can turn that around, given that it really doesn't need much in the way of updates because its intelligence comes from the thing it's connected to, not what it is.
Yeah. Well, but the reason I mentioned digital signage is because that is the use case they use. They don't actually use that local machine to do any of the showing. They connect to a remote machine. I know, or at least that's what I heard during the whole CrowdStrike issue.
Right.
Which our viewers should know, and if you don't, refer back to episodes named after the CrowdStrike. they were interesting. Interesting times, really. Now, I actually forgot you used to work at Sun Microsystems. You're a perfect person to talk about this stuff, really.
Why? What are we going to talk about?
Because that was one of the breads and butters of Sun Microsystems. This kind of remote access, instead of like remote devices, instead of like having a giant brain, then just have thin clients, or as they used to be at the time called terminals.
Yeah. Well, so actually, when you were talking about terminals earlier, you were talking about like dumb devices on desks. Long before I joined Sun Microsystems, my first jobs were working at a company who made mainframes. That was ICL, who have long since dissolved, but ICL was sort of Britain's big IBM sort of competitor. And we had a thing called OPD, they were called, one per desk. And they were basically like a green screen, like VT102 terminal with a telephone, built into the keypad. And when I started my first job, given that I was coming into that world having experienced home computers from the 1980s and also just started to see the sort of the first sort of PCs coming into existence, going into the workplace and being presented with this green screen terminal was utterly disappointing in terms of this was the place you were expected to be productive on a day-to-day basis. So they really were like literally dumb terminals. It was, I mean, some of them were networked back then, but they were like just literally serial connections to this massive bank of, terminal multiplexers on a mainframe, and that was your work environment, and it was frankly miserable.
So we're really returning to that point, except now it's VMs and are really underpowered computers.
Yeah, but none of this is new. If we go back even further, like we talk about like Unix and all the rest of it. Way back in the 50s, we had Multics as an operating system, and the way that Multics was being pitched at the time was like it was going to be a utility in the same way that we consider water companies and electricity companies to be utility service providers. And back then the expectation was there were only going to be like 5 computers in the world, because that's all the world needed was these 5 computers that we would all connect to. And that seems utterly ridiculous. But if we just think about that in sort of terms of client and server, if we think about our tablets and our phones and devices like this 365 link as being the clients, and then name the 5 computers, well, let's go with AWS and Azure and Google, with 3 of those services alone, we're not far away from that sort of dystopian idea that the world only needs five computers. It's just that those computers are a bit more massive than we envisaged 70 years ago.
And the catch is, like, if you look at a modern supercomputer or a modern mainframe, really, what difference is between a modern mainframe and a massive data center by Azure, by Microsoft?
Right.
Like, except that there is even more computers there. That's it. Like,
I mean, it's abstracted away a lot of that now, right?
Yeah,
we don't have to think about the physical units so much, about just having access to a slice of compute capability.
Even if I need a large piece of compute, if I need 64 cores or I need a really massive GPU for something, I don't think about buying that. I go, Microsoft Azure, I want 64 cores right now. 5 minutes later, after deployment is complete, I have full access to 64 cores. There it is.
Yeah, and that buying sort of times of slices of time on a large computer, that is the mainframe model.
Yeah.
Except that back in the day, you used to haggle with other members of the organization you worked in as to whose job really had priority. So we even today in Unix and Linux operating systems, we have this idea of jobs and priority, and that is basically a technical implementation of the human-based arguments that used to happen before that software capability existed.
And it should be important to know that this kind of idea of computing, of using remote resources, is still a thing in companies. Like big companies that might not have, might have data that is top secret classified, or even bigger, may need to have it stored separately than their normal operating data. So you cannot just have your Mike, the data scientist, who goes around with his laptop just gathering the data, even though if he needs to work with it. So what he does, he RDPs, that's the point, remote desktop protocol, or he VNCs, or whichever protocol he uses into that bank of servers, which has maybe possibly even, I don't know what kind of AGX or whichever insane GPU cluster by NVIDIA, and does work on that thing, even though he is possibly 2-3 buildings away on his laptop.
And the other thing is, of course, is that if you take sort of data science or machine learning as like the domain, when you connect in, you're on this thin client, but you've now got all of that compute capability directly adjacent to your large models and whatever it is you want to, work with and build with. So, it has those advantages, and it's always been economically more beneficial for organizations to rent equipment rather than go through capex and pay for equipment outright. So I saw that these links are initially on like this loan-based system, but they will be up for sort of outright purchase.
Because you just announced that they want to first feel the customers out, see what they actually think. But let's give some more contemporary, more consumer-based example. Video games. Your xCloud, your NVIDIA, GeForce, what?
It was Grid originally, wasn't it?
That's the local version, but GeForce Now.
GeForce Now, yeah.
Or you may remember, now sadly dead, Google Stadia.
Right. I was
Amazon
a Stadia.
Luna.
I used to be a Stadia and Google Now. I used to be a Stadia and NVIDIA Now customer, and got some utility out of that cloud-based gaming. As a Linux user, it was a way to get access to some games that simply do not work on Linux, predominantly these days because of like anti-cheat not working. It was a way to access an additional slice of games that weren't available. And I have to say, of those services, is it Xbox Cloud? Is that all Pass or whatever it's called?
Xbox Cloud. I think it's
Game Pass.
Game Pass is the subscription.
Yeah,
but
it's
very
very good.
xCloud. Yeah. And if you need a more you example, if you're like a Linux user, or if you have a Steam Deck, have you ever used Steam Link?
Yeah, I've got an original Steam Link right next to me, actually.
That's another example. That's a very me example, because my laptop doesn't have all that much horsepower. It's a really lame device. It was made to code on. Well, I video edit on it. I play games on it. Games that could never run on it. I'm like a city or 2 cities away from my computer. Yet I use the resources of that computer at home with that big GPU, way too much RAM and way too much CPU for me to actually use for that use case. But still, I can run any game I want.
Yeah.
Because Steam Link allows me that. That's the thing that this Microsoft Windows 365 link will allow you. Of course, it is too limited in my opinion, because it only allows connecting to a specific instance of Microsoft Windows 365
That's
computers.
by design, I think, though,
Yeah,
right? That's
the security.
That's not an accident.
It's the security. It's ease of
Well,
use
it's also the walled garden of
Yeah.
like, you know, it's part of the Microsoft sort of portfolio. It's not a general purpose device.
Yeah. At this point, they don't even allow access to their other this type services, even to their government users, for their government cloud.
I was surprised that wasn't a launch application, that the Microsoft government services is not actually supported right now.
My guess is after they like get the first kinks out of the whole like first launch, they will probably offer governments their own government link.
Right.
So it's basically set up to only connect to the link to the Windows 365 cluster
Their
that is for government.
on-prem or segregated allocation or whatever. Yeah.
They have, from what I understand, government has their own data centers for Azure.
Yeah.
The cloud,
they
the
do.
government data centers. That's probably the differentiator, because you have a different entry point.
Yeah.
Which is because my guess is that entry point that host name is baked into the device, or at least
Probably at the moment.
to the firmware, not firmware, but the OS that is there, because it still is some sort of an OS there.
Yeah,
And
if I
it's
was
probably
producing
baked
the
in.
MVP, that was definitely what I would do as well. Is just
Yeah.
like connect to where the most number of customers are that you can actually demo and work with before you get into the more nuanced solutions.
Then like next version could allow them to connect to the government and to the Azure Virtual Desktop and their Dev box, which is essentially that, but made specifically for development. Again, hosted in Azure.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is they're doing something of like first version. Let's go where most of our users are.
Yeah.
Then we can branch out and make it more, I don't know, customizable to specify the endpoint instead of going to just that one endpoint.
I mean, again, it feels like peak Microsoft, because, you know, back in the day, the Microsoft mantra was satisfy most of the people most of the time. You know,
Yeah.
that was like the 80-20 rule is sort of what they went after. Not solve all of the problems for all of the people, but solve most of the problems for most of the people.
Yeah. And I think that going back to that model might not actually be that bad of an idea, because at the end of the day, we already do it. Just more, I don't want to say distributed, but more broken. Well, the internet, the website, that's every time you use, I don't know, your any application that is run in your browser instead of on your computer, like Google Sheets, you're essentially doing that model, just using a front end that is browser instead of transferring video to you, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this way we all may gain something if we return back to that old school model, shall we say, even though it was never actually never old to begin with.
Yeah, well, it was never old. I mean, it's never gone away either. I don't feel like this is a what's the word? A renaissance of that sort of, you know, technology. I think this is just a continuation of the fact that there is a massive business sector that operates that way. And as you pointed out earlier, when it comes to like the security model, the bring your own device thing might sound cool and kitsch and all the rest of it, but it's a security and compliance nightmare. And for organizations that are actually trying to tick those boxes in because they're working in industry where they absolutely require those sort of security and compliance credentials, bring your own device just doesn't work. But something like this device, it's relatively inexpensive. You can give one to all of your contractors. You can cut them off when their contractual period ends. You don't even have to care about reclaiming the device because it was so inexpensive. It's designed to satisfy, that business market.
And in the sit and go offices where on the same chair, tomorrow someone else may sit and today
right.
This
Hot
is a
desk
perfect
environments.
Device.
Yeah.
You
Talked about,
when I was that's it.
Yeah, when I was at Sun, it was something that we did really well, was a partnership with AT&T, which is you could walk into Sun Microsystems anywhere in the world and you logged into a Unix workstation. It didn't just bring up your environment, but the phone next to you was your phone number, was automatically connected as you, and your call rotor was automatically, brought up front and center. This technology existed a long time ago, and this is just, the modern expression of bringing that, hot desk and workforce rotation, into being again.
I remember working in a more traditional environment where all the computers were in Active Directory, and you had that session transfer with desktop switching, but it was never
roaming.
All that, that roaming, all that seamless. Even I forget the proper terminology these days.
My
seamless.
Yeah, my guilty secret is for many years I was like a Windows Enterprise architect, as my day job. So, dealing with domain trees and roaming profiles and all the rest of it was something I used to do at the turn of the century.
And it was never seamless. Like, even if I logged in like 3 offices over, I still had, like, things just didn't feel the same as they did on my personal work machine. But with something like this, things definitely feel much more close to what you should be used to, because, well, it is your system. It isn't someone else's system with your coat of paint.
Yeah.
It is literally your system. Whether you are at your office in London, at your office in Ljubljana, or at the partner office in New York.
Right.
And I think for companies, this can bring some only good things for us companies that are already on that workflow. But I don't think it will convince the more hip companies that have the bring your own device ideas already ingrained.
Yeah. And whilst it's a bit of a underpowered and, broadly speaking, uninteresting device, what do you reckon your estimations are for how long somebody gets it running Linux and how long before it's running Doom and Quake?
Honestly, I think it's going to take a bit more than probably around 6 months to a year.
Right, that sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
My guess is when they get released, it's gonna be all just companies, but as soon as they get first time recycled, it's gonna take no time at all.
Yeah, there'll be a few interested hackers that get hold of them, but probably when they start to filter out in a few years' time,
that's gonna be the explosion of it.
Yeah. Well, I wonder what we could do with these things at home. Like if you can run a Linux on it on this low power, because it's a low power device, right? You could use this as your home assistant server, for example.
Well, if I get hand on it, I'm gonna do exactly the thing that it was supposed to do.
Use it as a thin client.
Except instead of connecting to Azure, it's gonna be connecting to my desktop and few servers that I run to keep my remote desktop active.
Yeah, very nice.
But let's switch topics over to you. So we already mentioned you worked at Sun Microsystems, but what else do you do? I hear you have a very interesting system. I hear bespoke, like your Linux system is kind of bespoke,
Well,
right?
well, yeah, because these days I run NixOS, and so everyone's NixOS system is bespoke, right? It's tailor-made for the individual that curated it for themselves. So yeah, I would say that, my operating system today is very much a fit and finish for myself. And in terms of like desktop experience, I've in recent times, for about the last 4 months or so, I've been experimenting with the different sort of modern breed of Wayland compositors and that sort of curation of the different Wayland-based technologies that exist. So the different panels and lockers and idle managers and wallpaper managers. So what I'm talking to you from right now is Hyperland with Waybar and Foozle and all of that good stuff. So it's actually what's interesting to me is that the whole debate in the Linux community about whether Wayland is ready or not is kind of a confused conversation, because Wayland is not one thing. And a lot of people consider Wayland to be the Wayland that you consume with GNOME. And in my estimation, that is the weakest of the Wayland implementations.
I'm not sure. I have here.
Oh, I'm certain, actually.
Well, I am also on Wayland. It works great. Like, I've been on Wayland for the last, 2 years?
Right.
Long time. And that means an NVIDIA GPU, that means a touchscreen. Actually, it might be more than 2 years, because this laptop isn't 2 years old. It's older. And only reason I can use the touchscreen is because of Wayland. Actually didn't work. Or this correctly.
So there's a lot of things about sort of coming into using Wayland for real that you see cited as things that won't work or don't work well. And I'm thinking things that I've seen is like screen grabbing, copy and pasting of windows, and copy and paste of your input and all the rest of it, that sort of thing. All of that is a solved problem and has been for a long time.
We're recording on Wayland right now.
Right, we both are. Yeah, exactly. But specifically that sort of screen capture, that bit is a little bit still raw.
Yes.
So I used to live stream regularly, and around February time, due to hardware problems that I had, I stopped. I've sorted those hardware problems out, and I've been going through this sort of transition to doing the Wayland thing. And it's only within the last couple of weeks that the stars have aligned, that actually to be able to do what I used to do on live streams under Wayland is possible again. And it really comes down to the maturity and the reliability of that whole screencasting, grabbing a window or a window region or a whole monitor and being and knowing it's going to work all of the time, every time.
Yeah, it's also that not everybody sees every implementation of Wayland, because Wayland is a set of protocols, set of standards, we should say.
Yeah.
That you have to implement, or you might implement into your compositor, desktop environment, whichever term you want to use. That's the catch. So maybe your Sway, your Hyperland, or your GNOME, they may
KDE.
have, or KDE's KWin. They all have different sets of implementations.
They're broadly similar these days, but they each sort of cherry pick some of the faster moving things like Sway and Hyperland and Niri and Miracle WM. They're sort of like picking some of these newer emerging protocols that solve some of the more sort of edge case but more interesting sort of contemporary problems. Whereas in my estimation, GNOME is moving too slowly in the way that it's accommodating some of this sort of protocol adoption for what it needs to do.
Yeah, that I agree, but I think it also comes down to who's your target audience.
Oh, for sure.
It's very clearly that Hyperland and Sway and that kind of compositor mainly targets enthusiasts, while Gnome targets people like me, people who want to just get shit done.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that's always existed, though, right? Even when we go back to just X11, there were those people that were building their own desktop experience using tiling window managers and dmenu and all of that, all of the tooling that exists in those spaces, and they weren't using the off-the-shelf desktop environments such as GNOME and KDE and Mate and XFCE and all the rest of it. And I suppose that all we're seeing is just the continuation of that build your own experience happening in the Wayland space now. Sway was the first mover there, I think, really. But in the last sort of 2 years, we've seen a number of really interesting Wayland compositors crop up. There's sort of 4 that I'm most interested in right now. There's Hyperland, which I'm using right now. And then there's Niri, which is one of these sort of like infinite scrolling window managers, which I like mostly for like laptops and mobile devices, because you don't deal with workspaces so much there. It's kind of nice. And then for a more traditional sort of floating stacking window environment, there's Mirrorway, which clue in the name there is that uses Mir, which is now a Wayland compositor. And then there's Miracle WM, which I've spoken to the developers. Well, I used to work with Alan Griffiths, who's the creator of Mirrorway, and I met the developer for Miracle WM at the Ubuntu Summit a couple of months ago, who's now working at Canonical on the Mir team. And I'm hoping that Miracle WM could become the place I actually end up on, because whilst I'm using Hyperland right now, I'm experimenting with all of these, but I feel like Miracle WM is headed in the direction that could satisfy a broad user group, because you talked about yourself, like you just want it to work. At the moment, Miracle WM is like most of these Wayland compositors, where you get into a configuration file and you express your desired outcome through typing up a bunch of config. But on the Miracle WM sort of roadmap is that this will have a UI to actually configure that experience, so you don't just have to go in and actually twiddle all of the bits yourself.
I've been always of opinion that desktop or a computer operating system should get out of your way. And to me, the desktop environment, the compiler, is an extension of an OS, which means it should get out of my way as soon as possible.
Yeah, I understand that sentiment. That's how I feel about my car. It's how I feel about my car now. Like when I leave the house in the morning, I want to open the door, get in the car, and it has a wheel in each corner for added mobility, and I can set off and do the journey that I need to do, and I don't have to think about how the engine was configured or what the tyre pressure is or any of those things. It just works. But years ago, my cousin and I used to build cars together, and he still does to this very day. He still builds custom cars. And I think that my cousin Andrew is much like myself. I am not going to be satisfied by an off-the-shelf computer running an off-the-shelf operating system, because as we discussed, I grew up with mainframes and Unix, and the reason I'm using Linux is because I like Unix, and I got into Linux because it was a cost-effective way to have a Unix-like operating system. And I'm just an enthusiast, you know. I like to build these systems and understand how it's put together and deal with the fact that I need to change the oil 3 times a week and tune the engine and all of that sort of stuff. You know, I enjoy that,
Yeah.
but it isn't for everybody. But, you know, for enthusiasts, it's manna from heaven. It's wonderful.
Well, it's kind of like me and Kubernetes clusters, Ceph clusters,
Right.
all the server stuff that I do. Any of the podcast hear a lot about it every time, but I know that you like this custom stuff. Well, you like it so much you made your own distro, after all.
Yeah, but not for me. That was the so we're talking about Ubuntu Mate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a curious thing, and so I think the first thing I should say there is this story is well known. I think we can go over it a bit, but Ubuntu Mate was made for my friends and family who I'd helped move to Linux back in the early 2000s, but it was never for me. It was always for them. And what we were just talking about with Hyperland and all of this, build it yourself and tune it and fiddle with it and fettle it until it's what you want it to be. What I have now, the operating system that I have put together over the last 18 months, is mine. It's for me, and it's selfish. It's a selfish expression of what I want computing to be. But Ubuntu Mate is not for me. It was made by me for other people.
Among those, me. Well, for a time, then it was made by you and others and me for people like me.
Right. Yes, so you were on the team for a spell.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the origins of that was that when I helped move my family over to friends and a small group of so my family and a small group of friends moved them over to Linux around like 2006 time. So this was when Ubuntu had their first LTS, and I was transitioning them from stuff like Windows 2000 and things like that. And that GNOME 2 based sort of Ubuntu back then was very similar to Windows, and even back then the same kind of software existed. They needed a web browser, they needed an email client, they needed an office suite, they needed to be able to print. And really, if it could do those things, you were golden. And back then it did those things perfectly fine. But then of course roll on a few years and we get into the GNOME 3 era, or the start of the GNOME 3 era, and Canonical moving to Unity. And whilst those were interesting user interfaces that definitely, Unity more so, I think, sort of, changed things up a little bit. For my non-technical friends and family,
that's not a good thing.
That's not what they wanted. I mean, like, until recently, like, Windows hasn't changed a whole lot. Like, in a very long time.
Changed, but general concept was the same.
And Mac OS is the same as well.
Yeah.
So having this massive sort of departure from that, desktop paradigm, I was faced with a bunch of friends and family who were like, well, I don't want this. I don't like it. I don't know how to use it. I don't want to have to relearn how to use my computer. And we did see some of that when Microsoft got a little bit experimental in Windows
8.
Was it Vista?
No, it was 8.
It was 8, was it? I can't remember the versions.
The tablet Windows, yeah.
Right.
In my opinion, still the best Windows there is.
And there was sort of a wholesale rejection of that, movement. So yeah, I got involved in the Mate project to patch it up and make it, usable, and then started working on Ubuntu Mate, because I think the first versions of Mate that I gave my family were running on top of Arch, and Arch is not something you want to put on novices' computers, that you see 2 or 3 times a year. You don't want to have that update worry. So enter Ubuntu, marry Ubuntu and the Mate desktop together, and before you know it, I've got a happy bunch of family members running that, and I get hired by Canonical to work on the desktop team.
Okay, but that's not how the first version of Ubuntu Mate came to be. Maybe you could share that story.
No, it's not. So, as I said, the first versions of Mate for my family were running on Arch Linux.
Yeah.
And one of my friends, Alan Pope, who at that time was on the Ubuntu podcast, invited me onto the Ubuntu podcast to talk about Mate. And during that conversation, I made some kind of off-the-cuff remark about the fact that at that time, Mate Desktop didn't work on Ubuntu because there were, library conflicts and what have you. And I could see he wasn't happy with that statement. So the very, very first version of Ubuntu Mate was created by Alan. And I think about 2 weeks after we recorded that episode of the Ubuntu podcast, this is before I was a presenter on the Ubuntu podcast, about a year before I joined the team, he sent me an email one day, and I think the subject of the email was just "ha," and then the body of the email was "I call this matey," and it was a link to an ISO image, and the ISO image was just called matey.iso, and he had done the work to marry together, I think at that time it was like Ubuntu 14.04 with the Mate desktop sort of grafted on top of it. And I ran that up in a virtual machine, and I was like, okay, my family had been using Ubuntu, originally with the GNOME 2 desktop, and I was like, I can see how this could be the thing that would satisfy them. So I think we got together about a month later, and Alan took a day off work, I took a day off work, I drove over to his house. He only lives about 20 minutes from here, and we sat in his kitchen all day, and we hammered out the very first underpinnings of what would become Ubuntu Mate together.
And since you mentioned you worked at Canonical, you have to tell me about snaps. What went wrong?
I don't think anything went wrong, really, at all.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, I mean, it's... I don't know. I think that maybe Canonical... This is unrelated to snaps. I think Canonical had started and stopped a number of projects over the years, long before snaps came around, and had also made some decisions to go their own way on a number of technologies, and had kind of got saddled with this "not invented here" sort of sentiment in the community. And I think snaps just kind of got tarred with that brush of Canonical are doing their own thing again. They really weren't. If you look back, if you wind the clock back, what was XDG app, which we now know as Flatpak, I think that project started 11 or 14 days after snaps, their first commits happened. These two technologies both happened independently of one another at about the same time. And although they took different approaches, were looking to solve the same kind of problems, but in different ways. And we just look around the landscape we're in today. I know you've been involved in the UBlue project.
Yeah.
That is an operating system that is immutable and uses container primitives, something that is powering the world right now. Linux and container technologies is
that's kind of the point.
Right, exactly. But Flatpak and snaps also utilize those same underpinnings. To deny that paradigm is the wrong way, is to deny the fact that the whole of the billions of dollars industry that we sit within, that is the direction of travel that industry is going in, and it is inevitable that we'll have to follow. And actually, if you say immutable and people get twitchy about what that means, immutability doesn't mean that you're somehow, handcuffed and constrained. It's actually a very powerful tool, because you can define what that immutable system looks like. So I don't think anything went wrong with snaps, other than the fact it was a technology created by Canonical, and there was some anti-Canonical sentiment in the community, and that's followed through a lot. I feel like, Red Hat backed technologies get a bit of a free ride. Even, you see how things have gone down with CentOS. You don't see a whole lot of fallout around, like, how that community got destroyed. If Canonical had done that, I think it would have gone very differently. Worse.
Yeah, but also maybe it's also because different target market, a lot more yelly target market is for snaps, the desktop people, whereas CentOS is servers primarily, and those people don't yell as much. They just get their shit done.
Well, what's interesting is that snaps originally came about because at that time Canonical were working on the phone. Yep. So when I joined Canonical, it was very much Unity 8 was the focus, and that was the project that I was working on when I joined the company. And snaps were a vehicle to sort of elevate the way that application delivery was going to work on the phones. Now, if you just think of a phone as an edge device or an IoT device, as we were talking about with the 365 link, that kind of containerized application delivery makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And, snaps have seen a real success in the IoT, edge, and embedded space, or how we now define embedded, because those goalposts have shifted over time. By embedded now we really mean sort of small and low cost, as opposed to microcontrollers and micro systems.
It's a lot wider territory than it used to be.
Exactly. So snaps have been very profitable there, and when I was at Canonical, I did work with, I'm not going to say the names, I'm pretty sure my NDA's up, but large organizations I would get flown out to, and I would do work with them and integrate snap based delivery platforms into the fabric of massive organizations and technologies that everyone is using. And it was very successful in those places. But we also, in order to make it sort of known and to promote it, and this was part of what me and the team that I worked on did, is, we approached organizations like Spotify and Slack and Skype and Visual Studio Code and, all of this desktop stuff in order to get them making snaps of the popular software, because Ubuntu is very popular on the Linux desktop, and this was one of the big failings of the phone. What actually sunk the Ubuntu phone was the lack of WhatsApp. And a few months ago, I spoke to an engineer who worked on Firefox OS back in the day, and they were saying that what sunk that project was the lack of WhatsApp on that phone, and they outlined all of the things they tried to do to get WhatsApp on the phone. And whilst they were taking a different approach, Canonical tried all sorts of things to get WhatsApp running on the Ubuntu phone. And one of those projects, which has now seen the light of day, is Anbox, to run Android apps on Linux. That was the way that internally we were trying to deliver, WhatsApp on the phone. And so I can't remember how I got to talking about the phone and WhatsApp. Oh yeah, that's right. So one of the things we were trying to do with snaps was to not have that WhatsApp moment. So that's why we went after the sort of, big applications that were big outside of just the Linux desktop space, in order to get them bought in on all of it, so we didn't have another WhatsApp moment with, you know, these applications on the desktop.
Yeah, I actually like snaps. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not in the vast majority of desktop users. I was just asking the edgy question. But
Yeah, it like, if you've done software packaging for, you know, Linux over the years, you'll probably have opinions about, you know, snaps versus any other packaging system.
well, yes, I've done.
Yeah, but it's irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter. Like, for the people that are using the computer and they just want to install software, so long as it downloads and it works, and that's the only thing that's actually important and could be the downfall of snaps, is that the latest software is available, and when you install it, it works, and it works properly. And there was a period where I felt like that was going really well. I think there's some rough edges there. There's some bits and pieces that aren't as well maintained as they once were. But, you know, by and large, Flatpak and snaps, they've been around for, 10 years now? They're pretty well established. I think, you know, it's inevitable that they will continue to be developed and will continue to be a vehicle to ship software on Linux.
I'm gonna say, whenever people ask me, when I say they should bring software to Linux, like what package to develop, what to do, I always say there is a standard environment, in my opinion, Flatpak. That is the standard environment now. But I do have to say a bit of disagreement. I think that how hard packaging is does affect the user in that exact thing. Because if it's too hard to package, there is less likely that, especially in the world back when there was just every distro had its own package manager, if it's like too hard to package or you go too out of your way, you will have less adoption, less chance that it will actually happen. Like, honestly, I still marvel at the fact that people actually develop their packages, because that it's comparably, and you have experience with Deb, you have experience with package built for Arch, the AL whatever Arch package,
PKG
Arch,
build.
yeah, that thing. You know how different those systems are, and how much more simple PKG builds are compared to the mess of directories that is their packages.
Yeah, there is probably at this point there is months of my life that I won't get back from having edited the Debian /copyright file, right, which actually has no bearing on
anything.
How successfully the bit of software I want to ship gets deployed. It's important, but I spend more time fettling the Debian copyright file than anything else that I've ever done with Debian packaging. And this isn't a criticism, because it has its place and it's important. And actually, in this world of SBOMs and SPDICs and license compliance and all the rest of it, having a Debian copyright file that's actually accurate is now coming into play as being a very valuable thing. But, you know, for me, sitting here in my back room working on stuff for fun, it is unfun editing the Debian copyright file and getting that right. Whereas snaps don't have that sort of overhead in terms of, you know, you don't have to read the Debian maintainers guide in order to produce a snap.
All you have to do is define one simple line of YAML. This is the license it uses.
Yeah, but you don't. Even that's optional.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that these days a lot of that distribution packaging, has been shifted left. The language ecosystem tools have grown the ability to spit out debs and snaps and app images and all the rest of it. And do you need a snap, a deb, and an app image to address the Linux market? No. Well, no, you don't. You only need maybe one or two of those at best. And so a lot of projects now will just use whatever their release tools are that produce these artifacts for them, and they don't even end up in like things like PPAs anymore or the repositories themselves. They sit there as artifacts in like GitHub release pages.
Yeah.
We see that increasingly.
Yeah, you see that quite a lot nowadays. But yeah, but problem is that came about at the same time as snaps, flatpaks, and app images. Like those two, how to say, evolutions of packaging came pretty parallel, honestly.
Yeah.
And that's and a bit of it is an effect of commercial success of people.
I don't know.
Even in that kind of an environment using Linux, because like people then want to have those things readily available. So even the programmers that got more how to say, more made better tooling, shall we say.
I don't know. I don't know it was like commercial interest. I think it was really down to the fact that Debs and RPMs at that time were welded, tightly coupled to the library versions that exist on the host operating system. And so we had our own version of DLL hell, in that, you couldn't take this deb of a thing that you'd downloaded a couple of years prior and expect it to work on, the modern version of Debian or Ubuntu, because the underlying libraries probably didn't align. And Flatpak and Snaps, a lot like OCI container images, were designed to make that problem go away, because you isolate everything together with its own runtime, and you don't have that problem anymore. And AppImage, to give them their credit, I have opinions about AppImage, but AppImage were solving that problem their way long before Flatpak and Snap appeared on the scene. And I still see to this day, people who are producing applications outside of the Linux space, they are not primarily interested in Linux. They are in a place where they just happen to be using tooling and technologies that means they can target Linux as an audience.
Deployment target.
They're quite often spaffing out, app images, because again, their language ecosystem tooling allows them to produce a number of different things. And unlike Flatpak and Snaps, where you really have to get it into FlatHub or the Snap store for it to be a real thing, app images are just a random download. It's the Windows paradigm of go and find the thing, download the thing, run the thing. So you still see a lot of interesting applications. Like you and I, before we started this, I was talking to you about DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci Resolve is an app image.
Yeah. And before we continue tugging on that thread of solving dependency hell, let's continue on the journey of Canonical and beyond. So how did you end up, where did you end up at the end in Canonical?
Canonical? Well, I went through all sorts of teams. I worked on the desktop team, then on the Snapcraft team, Snap Advocacy team, and then an engineering manager for a bunch of teams. So the desktop team and the Snapcraft team and the IoT team and the robotics team and some other things I've probably forgotten. And then I was engineering director for Ubuntu. So I was running a bunch of stuff at the height of my time there. And it was a lot of fun.
And based on my memory, you left at your height.
Maybe. So I left in early 2021. So it's a good long time ago now. And I think what I was most pleased with as like the last significant thing that I did there is since about 2015 I'd been working on Ubuntu Mate and fusing together Ubuntu and Mate on the Raspberry Pi, and I'd worked with people in the Raspberry Pi community to sort of make all of that happen. And for the Ubuntu 2010 release, which was the Groovy Gorilla, which also was the code name I got to choose by accident, we brought for the first time the Raspberry Pi as a first-class supported target to the Ubuntu ecosystem, and it has stayed as a release platform ever since. So that's probably the thing that I'm personally most pleased with, because it was a little bit of me over many years that I was able to bring into Canonical. But also the work we did with Lenovo, HP and Dell over the time I was there, we enabled way more new desktop and laptop devices over time than we ever had done before, and that was great.
And what happened afterwards? So where did you end up after Canonical?
Well, I ended up at a company called Slim AI with you.
Yeah. Well, you were first. I came after.
Yeah. So I joined Slim AI. That was a container security company. So the idea there is you take containers and through a process of analyzing them, you get a more secure container out the other end. And I started working there, and you joined, I don't know, about 6 months after I did, I think. And so we worked there for a couple of years together, I think. And I think that
about a year.
Was it? You were there a year?
Yeah, and you were there a bit,
okay.
a bit more.
I think I was there nearly 2 years. Yeah. And then I went and joined a company called Determinate Systems, which is where I am today.
We're back on tagging that thread. So what does Determinate System do?
So Determinate Systems, we build solutions around Nix and NixOS to make Nix and NixOS easy to use in enterprise deployments and scenarios.
Well, that is sorely needed in that space.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
And what's interesting is that Nix is very popular in those spaces because there's a number of properties of Nix that lends itself to those things we were talking about earlier with the Microsoft thing about compliance and regulatory tick box exercises. Nix has a number of attributes built into the way that software is composed and delivered that facilitates that, but it needs a little bit of gloss and shine and exposing those properties in a way that you can use in enterprises. So that's the sort of thing we're working on there. We've just been pulling the covers off stuff. So we've over the last I've been there just over 18 months, and over the last 4 weeks we did a series of blog posts of here's a bunch of stuff. So we've made a whole bunch of open source that we've released over the 18 months, but we've just started to pull the covers off what the enterprise capabilities are there.
Well, for me, what I know, the biggest thing you guys did in the last bit is the Determinate installer.
Right, that's what a lot of people know us for. Yeah. We've just made that a whole lot better as well, actually. Literally just last week.
Really?
So Graham, my boss, has been looking at where the edge cases were. So I think we had a 99.5% success rate on the install. And interestingly, one of our biggest targets is people using macOS to install Nix on macOS. Because I know a lot of people think that Nix and NixOS are one of the same, but they are not. They are separate things.
Yes.
And when Nix was originally created, it was a tool that was designed to run on top of any sort of Linux, Unix operating system, which is true to this day. You can install and use Nix on any Linux or Unix system, and that's how I started using it on top of Ubuntu. And you cannot deny that macOS is hugely popular in organizations as a development platform, particularly if you're targeting multiple platforms, because only
Sadly,
on macOS can you build for
macOS,
the Apple ecosystem and Windows and Linux and Unix.
Yeah. Sadly.
And Also, it has all of the enterprise management stuff, so it ticks all of those boxes as well. So yeah, there's a lot of people using Nix on top of Mac OS, and actually I've got two Macs. One that I got when I was at Canonical, which is an old Intel Mac, and more recently a MacBook Air M2, and I have both of those Macs fully managed by Nix, and it is absolute bliss. And really, my Macs really are just the way that I use them. It's just like Linux with a different desktop environment is how I manage them now, because I have all the same stuff available on those systems managed in the same way under one configuration. It's fantastic.
Yeah. As many of you who listen to this podcast, and especially those who know me, know that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of Nix of any form, whether it be in the OS form or the package manager form, and especially not in the language form.
It's glorious. It has changed my life like nothing. I can't. So it's not even a technology. I think the last thing that I learned that was as important to me and as life-changing professionally and personally that I learned was a process called Kepner-Trago. And this was, again, something I learned at Sun Microsystems. And it's not a technology. It is a way of thinking about troubleshooting problems. And it was a required component that everyone at Sun in the support organization went through, and you had to complete a competency in this thing. And the first couple of days I was in the first training course for this, I thought it was complete bullshit. And then on the third day, the penny dropped, and I realized just how good this was, and it changed my life. And to this day, right next to me here, I have my Kepner-Trago manual, and I have my little quick cards to remind myself. And when we have problems at work, I go through the mental process of like thinking about how we solve a problem through the Kepner-Trago process. Nix has been like that for me. It is a different way of doing Linux, and as it happens, Mac OS as well. But it's the last thing you ever need to learn. It's astonishingly powerful.
Well, like my history of NixOS is, well, pained. I actually tried NixOS at one point before you were at Terminal Systems, actually. Or were you just starting? I don't remember. But, well, I installed it on my system, had it for 6 months, and while I was intrigued by the idea, which is also the reason how I ended up on Ubuntu, I wasn't a fan of the whole execution of it. I think the execution of it is not well done, very much not well done.
So I'm not going to deny that there is some legitimate criticism of Nix and NixOS. I think the first one that everyone cites is the documentation, which actually I felt this way. So it's interesting because I've gone through this process, right? I've gone through this process of coming into Nix a bit green. I'd used it just for sort of basic home configuration management. I hadn't done the whole operating system thing. It was all very surface level. But I've gone through the process of like properly learning Nix and NixOS. And when I started that process, I felt like the documentation was lacking. I don't think that criticism is as accurate today as it was then. I don't think that the documentation today is perfect by any means, but it's definitely much better. But what Nix does demand of you is for you to actually learn it. There is no fast path. There you can ingest some quick sort of baseline understanding, but to get competent, it's not just a thing that you can just do and a couple of days later be done with it. And to put that into perspective, I carve out a minimum of 2 hours a day to learn something about Nix or Nix OS. And I've been doing that now for very nearly 2 years. And I think about 2 months ago, there was something that I worked on and I said, I am now intermediate. This was the point at which I got beyond like intermediate, like Nix skills. So it is, it's a lot to learn, and that's because it's lots of different things. As you say, it's a language. It's also configuration management. If you use Nix OS, it's an operating system. It's a package manager. It's a whole bunch of stuff. But the juice is worth the squeeze. If you invest some time into it, it is extraordinarily powerful. I have all of my containers, all of my virtual machines, my home lab server behind me, my production server at Hetzner, my 2 Macs, my laptops, my Raspberry Pis, my workstations here that are dual GPU and all of that good stuff. And it's all in one configuration file. And it is just amazing. Like, I think it's difficult to sell. It's difficult to sell, like how powerful it is and how life-changing it is. But what I'm seeing in industry is those sophisticated organizations that were early doors with things like Docker. So maybe they've been experimenting with like OpenVZ, like the embryonic like container platforms, and then they moved to Docker. They're now experiencing like their growing pains with like OCI container images, and you know the Docker promise isn't quite what they were sold on, and they are finding Nix now, and Nix solves the shortcomings that exist in that sort of container ecosystem. And what we're doing at Determinate Systems is then burring off the sharp edges of using Nix at scale to actually deploy and orchestrate, you know, stuff. So things like seamless Terraform interactions, because the state of the art of using Nix in Terraform is terrible. But we've actually sort of integrated it in a Terraform API driven kind of a way to actually sort of bring the power of Nix into those environments without you having to deal with Nix in those environments.
At the time, the big problem was documentation. Like, for example, I was trying to make a package of an application I wrote, and because of the way I do things, I have to make things custom. Like, I cannot just copy paste somebody else's work because of how insane things I make. And I remember I was reading documentation. First of all, there was very little of documentation on making packages as it was, and a lot of it was just saying go to Nix package repo and find a program that is compiled in a similar way as yours and copy that, or something. I don't remember the exact wording, but something to that effect. Essentially what people call code as documentation, which in my opinion is an absolute lunacy. There is no such thing as code being documentation.
So it is true that there's a lot of cargo culting that happens, but I think that's true of any language ecosystem. There is a manual. The Nix packages manual is the manual, and these are like traditional manuals in the Unix sense. There is a Nix OS manual, a Nix manual, and a Nix packages manual. And every facility of those 3 things is covered in those manuals. The problem is that if you're coming in green, that's a very dense 3 volumes of thousands of pages of documentation. What there aren't is some sort of good snippet high-level stuff. There's a few YouTube channels that cover some of this stuff now. And there's some sort of supplementary projects. We've created one, zerotonix.com, which is sort of a nice way to introduce people into how to use Nix, not just Nix OS, but how to use Nix on any Linux or Mac OS, and get you grounded in sort of the concepts and all the rest of it. But those 3 manuals now, actually, when I'm doing stuff, like complicated stuff, those 3 manuals always have the answers in them.
Well,
they are there, but I had to sort of kind of educate myself to some extent to understand some of what Nix was, which I think 0 to Nix does, in order that I then knew what I needed to find in those manuals to accomplish what I wanted to do. So I'm not going to say that the documentation is a solved problem, because it's not. But it is the documentation is actually very good. What we don't have is a good on ramp, or a smooth on ramp within the Nix and NixOS community.
I think I was actually like reading those, but they didn't have like a searchability of it, and like just finding the information I needed was very hard. Because like I have experience with packaging things. I have a lot of experience, like RPM, dep, flatpak, snap, arch package. Give me a packaging method, and I can make you a package with basic cheat sheets. Yeah. But just finding enough information to get started was extremely hard, and I kept finding information that was conflicting. And even just I actually followed that advice. I believe it was on NixOS documentation. It said that go to the repo and just look. I went, and like the information I read in the manual was conflicting with the information that was in the repo. I was like, wait, and I was trying things for a week. I was trying things like everything that was possible, and at one point, one thing didn't work. I went back to it, just reverted the commits so I could start over, and suddenly it worked. And things like that. So those were very edge cases like that I ran into. Like just the fact that you have 5 ways to do the same thing, like installing packages. I think it's actually 4. I like to say 5, but it's 4, I believe.
There's really only 1, but okay.
Well, there is only one right way. Yes, technically there are two right ways, but they have 2 different reasons why you do them. Yeah. One is to install into a single time shell, and one is to install into the system. But to get to those points, you have like 4 different, and in some cases it's not well documented what do they actually mean, because you have the configuration way of installing packages onto your local system, you have a command line way of installing on your local system, you have a configuration way to installing on a shell, and a command line way to installing a shell.
Correct way technically is through the configuration. The imperative way of installing packages is just a convenience. You don't install packages on NixOS the way that you apt install or DNF install on other distributions. That's
I
not how you use it. But
when I'm doing things, I don't like what is the right, what is the wrong way. I'm gonna just do things the way
I think the thing I struggled with is that I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't understand how to articulate that in a way that was compatible with the sort of the Nix way of doing things. So, for example, earlier today I was working on a package, and this is something I've only recently learned, and I'm not going to explain all of this, but I now understand that what I needed to make was a Nix derivation that had a fixed output. Okay, now that's all Nix stuff. But I have learned that's what I needed to do.
Let me cut you off for a bit. You can continue after I say. For all of you who are into programming, Nix language is a functional language. So swallow that piece of information how you want. I'm gonna afterwards. I'm gonna say what I think about it, because that's another gripe as well. So continue, please.
I think it has to be functional because of the way that it works. They're kind of hand in glove. But because I've been using it for a while, I knew that that was what I needed to create, and I'd never done it before. But because I've been using Nix for a while, and I have read the documentation and I have read the manuals, I knew what the Nix way to express this problem was, and then I was able to find the documentation in the Nix packages manual that helped me actually solve the problem. So the documentation is there, but I don't deny it does require some upfront effort. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think, because it is a sophisticated system and it's very powerful, and it's worth investing some time in yourself to learn it, to then be able to wield that power responsibly.
And since we talked about language, and I did say it was one of my gripes, yes, language is honestly not that great. Maybe because it is functional.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not a fan of functional languages. I find that it was a discipline that I never learned formally during my computer science studies or at university. It was something that we touched on, but it wasn't a core feature. So I have always felt a little bit at sea with the concepts of functional programming, but I do understand why Nix has to be implemented in a functional way, and actually there's some very powerful properties about that now,
Yes.
which I have started to understand. And it's like that penny drop moment. It's like, I may have defined that this thing has a value, and now I can just reference that I want to use whatever the value of that thing may be without actually caring, what the value is. It's remarkably powerful stuff. But it's a change from, I don't know, established norms maybe, but it's potent stuff. It's worth learning. It's definitely worth learning.
And the second thing is that it's essentially a programming language.
Yeah.
Which also I don't think is... I understand people use it in all sorts of ways, but sorry, that goes against everything that is, in my opinion, good and okay.
Why?
For a configuration like
well, how's that different from Ansible or Chef? They have DSLs.
Yes, but they're
just
part of you do not define actual things in code. There's a reason I don't like what's the thing called Volumi.
Okay.
I think this stuff should not go in code. They should go in what is.
We live in a software-defined world now, so actually having the software installation actually coupled with the configuration is massively powerful, and having syntax around that configuration, so I've used Chef and Ansible over the years, and something else as well. I can't remember what it was, but I've definitely used Chef and Ansible. And they kind of mostly work most of the time. But Nix is a configuration language. The installation of the software, the provisioning of the software, isn't separate from the configuration of the software. Those two are intrinsically linked. So you can rely on the fact that when you have a configuration that says, I want a Caddy server provisioned on this machine and I want it configured in this way, that those two things actually happen in harmony and you can't break them. Like they're welded. And when you fix problems with Nix, as in when you define a solution with Nix, you only ever have to do it once. It's done. It's a solved problem. It is worth a squeeze. And like I say, there are lots of organizations out there, significant organizations that are using Nix in vast and interesting ways. And whilst, yes, there's a documentation gap, and we've been working on some ways to improve the way that self-documentation happens within Nix modules and flakes and things of that nature, there's also some there's a lot of work that's happened in and around Nix and NixOS for enthusiasts, which make it great for people like you and I that just want to, like, you know, hack on stuff and make interesting things. But for organizations, they need a whole extra level of sophistication and capability. And that doesn't get a lot of love from the community. So there's, you know, a number of like professional organizations in and around the Nix community that are sort of servicing those sort of interests, and you know, that's what we're doing. And what that will do is that will trickle down a lot, like the way we talked about, like how container primitives have become the way that, you know, modern Linux packaging and software delivery happens via Flatpak and Snap and App Image and all the rest of it, and OCI container images. I think a lot of the investment that we'll see in solving problems for enterprises with those organizations that are helping big organizations use Nix and NixOS, we'll see that trickle down into the Nix and NixOS community to make it more accessible and easier to use and exploit those powers and capabilities more readily.
Now, do you have any other pitches for me? Because, you know, maybe to convince me that I should try the whole thing again, beyond what you already mentioned.
I would say for anyone that is listening to this that keeps hearing about Nix and NixOS, go and have a look at Zero to Nix. It's a website that you can read and follow in 5-minute batches of time over several lunch breaks in a week, and it will actually have you install Nix on your Linux or Mac machine, run through some basic stuff, introduce you to the core concepts, and set you up with, okay, I understand what this thing is and how to use it, and in particular it'll introduce you to development environments. And if you are a developer, this is manna from heaven. This is how I got hooked, was doing my dev environments. But if you're not wanting to fully commit, you don't have to go full NixOS, and that isn't how I started. So I didn't jump right into NixOS at the beginning. I would say install Nix on your Mac, on your Linux, and start to experiment with dev environments, just using Nix to get access to the latest software. Because when you install Nix on your Linux, anything that you access from Nix is entirely isolated from the rest of the system. You cannot hose your existing Fedora or Ubuntu or Debian system with what you do with Nix, because it's all isolated. But if you want on RHEL or Debian the latest versions of things, then Nix gives you access to that stuff without busting it. And also on macOS, Nix can manage your brew file. It is a better interface to Homebrew than Homebrew. It can also, on macOS, be the way you install the applications from the Mac App Store. So, you know, it's excruciatingly powerful. So I would just encourage people, take a look at Zero to Nix, have a play with it. It's perfectly safe, and Zero to Nix will explain to you how to install Nix using the determinate installer, which Bigpod explained earlier is what we're known for. It's the best way to install Nix, and it's also the safe way to uninstall Nix as well. So if you choose to experiment with it, it has a full receipt, and if you choose to uninstall, there's a single line uninstall, and the whole thing will go away as if it was never there before. So it's a completely safe way to dip your toes into the water and have a play.
Okay. Honestly, I'm still not sure. To me,
Nice.
No matter what, it still sounds like idea of it is great. No matter what idea of it is great. I still have problem with that language and all that. Like
the language is simple. It's basically JSON with lambdas. It's pretty straightforward.
That's the part that I don't like, lambdas. I use them all the time in C#. I not the biggest fan of them. So, and like my experience with functional languages is one of those. I learned one. I still have no idea where would I use that.
Yeah, I've had to dabble with functional languages over the years, but Nix is the first. I don't. Yeah, I've not like gone into Haskell and stuff, but I've used some of the other functional languages only because projects have cropped up through my career where it's like, oh, okay.
Well, I think this has been going on long enough. We're gonna be hitting an hour and 40 minutes soon. So it's gonna be the longest episode, but oh well, there is no Josh to keep me on the time. So before we go, I would first of all like to tell it we have an email. You can see it if you're a video version right below me. It's contact@tagspace.com. I think so. I don't know the email. That's Josh's department. I just put it on the screen. Yeah, it's contact@tagspace.com. And you can find me and Josh on the same links on these names on Mastodon. We both are on Mastodon. You can also, if you use any other federated social media like Instagram threads, first time we said that right first time. If you live in US and stuff like that, you should be able to access Mastodon. So follow us. Also, we now have a link for or a card for our Patreon. Go check us out. We could use your help. This hosting of this isn't cheap or free. We after all have our own host for the podcast, the audio version, and now we also have a card for me and Josh's YouTube channel. Of course, I don't know when either of us will upload the next video, but that's another problem entirely. Now, where we can find you, Martin?
You can find me at wimpysworld.link. So that's one URL. Hopefully you'll find below, and that's a page which is everywhere you can find me. And if you're watching the video version, you may have seen this logo, that logo. So you can find me and my friends. That's my friends Alan and Mark, and we do a podcast called Linux Matters, and you can find us at linuxmatters.sh.
There's gonna be a card, and all the links should be also in either in YouTube description or show notes. Yes, they should be. Mm-hmm. Now, before we bid you guys adieu, there's also the announcement that our regular listeners probably heard enough times. During the last week of December, when Josh has his shutdown period, we're gonna be doing a massive live stream. And it's gonna be many days of just streaming without stop between me and Josh. And we're gonna be doing all sorts of things. And you can affect how long the stream will last by giving a subscribe on YouTube during the stream and giving us some money on Patreon. We hope you join us for as long as you can. There's going to be some interesting stuff happening, like playing games, like recording of an episode. We're going to probably do that, and then we're going to edit the same episode live on air. So you're going to be able to see and hear how horribly the sausage is made. So I think that should be it. Did I forget something? Well, I forgot to thank you for joining me in this episode.
My pleasure, and thank you for inviting me on, and it was lovely to speak to you again after all this time.
And thank you everybody for listening. Goodbye.